Hello and welcome to today's episode of The Jungle. Today I'm planning on reading page 24 to about page 29, I think will be about right. So to catch us up on the story, our main characters are from Lithuania. The main character's name is Jurgis. His girlfriend, who then he ends up marrying, becomes his wife, is named Ona. They meet because Jurgis is sent to like a state fair type situation to sell his father's horses, and instead he falls in love with Ona at first sight. After his entire life having said that marriage was a stupid trap for a man to fall into, he just looks at her and is suddenly in love. The problem is that her family is very wealthy and they have no intention of selling her off to a country bumpkin like Jurgis. So he goes back home and he tries to forget about her for a while and tries to go on with his life, and it becomes obvious that he can't forget about her because they're so in love. Put up with the love story for a little while because after that point everybody dies. That's all that happens for the rest of the book. So you get this little bit of a love story at the beginning. The two of them plus their extended family, these other people who they're related to, all end up moving to the United States in the hopes to make a better life for themselves, to kind of follow the American dream, the idea that if you work really hard in the United States, anything is possible. But remember, this is the Gilded Age. And in the Gilded Age, everything looks like it's wonderful. Something looks like it's beautiful and made out of expensive material. But when you scratch the surface of life in the United States at this time, most people's lives were absolutely miserable. And that's what our characters are going to find. During this segment, a couple times they refer to cars. Let's just get that out of the way now. When they refer to cars, this is still before automobiles are very common in the United States. They will be becoming more common in the next 10 years or so after this book is written. But right now, when they talk about cars, they're talking about train cars or like a streetcar, a trolley car type system that would have run through the city of Chicago, because that's where our story takes place. And kind of like public transportation, but more like a little tiny train trolley that would have run through town. Okay, so they've come to the United States. They get in trouble with a fake police officer for a while, and they lose a lot of their money. He rips them off. He's a con man, not a real police officer, but it's kind of their first experience here, and it scares them pretty badly. It was in the stockyards that Jonas's friend had gotten rich, and so to Chicago the party was bound. They knew that one word, Chicago? And that was all they needed to know, at least, until they reached the city. Then, tumbled out of the cars without ceremony, they were no better off than before. They stood staring down the vista of Dearborn Street, with its big black buildings towering in the distance, unable to realize that they had arrived, and why, when they said, "Chicago?" people no longer pointed in some direction, but instead looked perplexed or laughed or went on without paying any attention. They were pitiable in their helplessness. Above all things, they stood in deadly terror of any sort of person in official uniform. And so, whenever they saw a policeman, they would cross the street and hurry by. For the whole of the first day, they wandered about in the midst of deafening confusion, utterly lost. It was only at night that, cowering in the doorway of the house, they were finally discovered and taken by a real policeman to the station. In the morning, an interpreter was found, and they were taken and put upon a car and taught a new word, stockyards. Their delight at discovering that they were to get out of this adventure without losing another share of their possessions, it would not be possible to describe. They sat and stared out of the window. They were on a street which seemed to run on forever, mile after mile, 34 of them if they had known it, and each side of it, one uninterrupted row of wretched little 2-story frame buildings. Down every side street they could see, it was the same. Never a hill and never a hollow, but always the same endless vista of ugly and dirty little wooden buildings. Here and there would be a bridge crossing a filthy creek, with hard-baked mud shores and dingy sheds and docks along it. And here and there would be a railroad crossing, with a tangle of switches and locomotives puffing and rattling freight cars filing by. Here and there would be a great factory, a dingy building with innumerable windows in it, and immense volumes of smoke pouring from the chimneys, darkening the air above and making filthy the earth beneath. But after each of these interruptions, the desolate procession would begin again, the procession of dreary little buildings. A full hour before the party reached the city, they had begun to note the perplexing changes in the atmosphere. It grew darker all the time, and upon the earth the grass seemed to grow less green. Every minute, as a train sped on, the colors of things became dingier, the fields were parched and yellow, the landscape hideous and bare. And along with the thickening smoke, they began to notice another circumstance, a strange, pungent odor. I want to describe pungent to you. So pungent most similarly means strong. So like a skunk smell is a pungent odor. Some people find skunk smell to be really, really bad, and some people, I wouldn't say they enjoy it, but they don't find it to be like a disgust smell. If you think back to our discussion about disgust mechanisms and your 3 kinds of disgust, skunk smell doesn't really have a natural survival reason to disgust you. And for some people it's that strong and that overpowering of a smell that it is disgusting. And for some people it is instead just merely pungent, meaning very, very strong, overwhelming, like you can almost feel it in your eyes and in your nasal cavity. They were not sure that it was unpleasant, this odor. Some might have called it sickening, but their taste in odors was not developed, and they were only sure that it was curious. Now, sitting in the trolley car, they realized that they were on their way to the home of the smell, that they had traveled all the way from Lithuania to it. It was now no longer something far off and faint that you caught in whiffs. You could literally taste it, as well as smell it. You could almost take hold of it in your hands, almost examine it at your leisure. They were divided in their opinions about it. It was an elemental odor, raw and crude. It was rich, almost rancid, sensual and strong. There were some who drank it in as if it were intoxicant. There were others who put their handkerchiefs to their faces. The new immigrants were still tasting it, lost in wonder, when suddenly the car came to a halt, and the door was flung open, and a voice shouted, "Stockyards!" They were left standing upon the corner, staring. Down a side street there were 2 rows of brick houses, and between them a vista, 6 chimneys, tall as the tallest of buildings, touching the very sky, and leaping from them 6 columns of smoke, thick, oily, and black as night. It might have come from the center of the world, this smoke, where the fires of the ages still smolder. It came as if self-impelled, driving all before it, a perpetual explosion. It was inexhaustible. One stared, waiting to see it stop, but still the great streams rolled out. They spread in vast clouds overhead, writhing, curling, then uniting in one giant river. They streamed away down the sky, stretching a black pall as far as the eye could reach. Then the party became aware of another strange thing. This, too, like the odor, was a thing elemental. It was a sound made up of 10,000 little sounds. You scarcely noticed it at first. It sank into your consciousness, a vague disturbance, a trouble. It was like the murmuring of the bees in the spring, the whisperings of the forest. It suggested endless activity, the rumbling of a world in motion. It was only by an effort that one could realize that it was made by animals, that it was the distant lowing of 10,000 cattle, the distant grunting of 10,000 swine. They would have liked to follow it up, but alas, they had no time for adventures just then. The policeman on the corner was beginning to watch them, and so, as usual, they started up the street. Scarcely had they gone a block, however, before Jonas was heard to give a cry and began pointing excitedly across the street. Before they could gather the meaning of his breathless ejaculations, he had bounded away, and they saw him enter a shop over which was a sign, J. Sibelius, Delicatessen. When he came out again, it was in company with a very stout gentleman in shirt sleeves and an apron, clasping Jonas by both hands and laughing hilariously. Then Teta Elzbieta recollected suddenly that Sibelius had been the name of the mythical friend who had made his fortune in America. To find that he had been making it in the delicatessen business was an extraordinary piece of good fortune at this juncture. Though it was well on in the morning, they had not breakfasted, and the children were beginning to whimper. Thus was the happy ending to a woeful voyage. The two families literally fell upon each other's necks, meaning like they hugged each other. And for it had been years since Jacobus Sibelius had met a man from his part of Lithuania. Before half the day, they were lifelong friends. Jacobus understood all the pitfalls of this new world and could explain all of its mysteries. He could tell them the things they ought to have done in the different emergencies. And what was still more to the point, he could tell them what to do now. He would take them to Pony Anil, who kept a boarding house the other side of the yards. Old Mrs. Eucnian, he explained, had not what one would call choice accommodations, but they might do for the moment. To this, Teta Elzbieta hastened to respond that nothing could be too cheap to suit them just then, for they were quite terrified over the sums they had had to expend. A very few days of practical experience in this land of high wages had been sufficient to make clear to them the cruel fact that it was also a land of high prices, and that in it the poor man was almost as poor as in any other corner of the earth. And so there vanished in a night all the wonderful dreams of wealth that had been haunting Jurgis. What had made the discovery all the more painful was that they were spending, at American prices, money which they had earned at home rates of wages, and so they were really being cheated by the world. The last 2 days they had all but starved themselves, and it made them quite sick to pay the prices that the railroad people had asked them for food. Yet, when they saw the Could you get down, please? Yet when they saw the home of the widow Eucnian, they could not but recoil. Even so, in all their journey, they had seen nothing so bad as this. Pony Anil, and the P-O-N-I, if you're following along in the book, that's another honorific term. It's a term that you would use for someone who you're not really on a first name basis with. It's like aunt, if you're calling somebody you're not related to your aunt. Pony Anil had a 4-room flat in one of that wilderness of 2-story frame tenements that lie back of the yards. There were 4 such flats in each building, and each of the 4 was a boarding house for the occupancy of foreigners, Lithuanians, Poles, Slovaks, or Bohemians. Some of these places were kept by private persons, some were cooperative. There would be an average of half a dozen boarders to each room. Sometimes there were 13 or 14 to one room, 50 or 60 people to a flat. Each one of the occupants furnished his own accommodations, that is, a mattress and some bedding. The mattresses would be spread upon the floor in rows, and there would be nothing else in the place except a stove. And by a stove, it's like a wood-burning stove for heat. It was by no means unusual for two men to own the same mattress in common, one working by day and using the mattress by night, and the other working at night and using it in the daytime. Very frequently, a lodging house keeper would rent the same beds to double shifts of men. Mrs. Eucnian was a wizened-up little woman with a wrinkled face. Her home was unthinkably filthy. You could not enter by the front door at all, owing to the mattresses, and when you tried to go up the back stairs, you found that she had walled up most of the porch with old boards to make a place to keep her chickens. It was a standing jest or joke of the boarders that Anil cleaned house by letting the chickens loose in the rooms. Undoubtedly, this kept down the vermin, but it seemed probable, in the view of all the circumstances, that the old lady regarded it rather as feeding the chickens than as cleaning the rooms. The truth was that she had definitely given up the idea of cleaning anything under pressure of an attack of rheumatism, which had kept her doubled up in one corner of her room for over a week, during which time 11 of her boarders, heavily in her debt, had concluded to try their chances of employment in Kansas City. This was July, and the fields were green. One never saw the fields, nor any green thing whatsoever, in Packingtown. But one could go out on the road and hobo it, as the men phrased it, and see the country and have a long rest and an easy time riding in the freight cars. Thanks!